Hi, I'm Abby. I have a lot of records. And this is Vinyl Monday. So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the series where once a week I sit down and talk about a classic album I love. If 20-minute episodes aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds, both here on my channel and over on my Instagram. Getting this one out of the way before we get much farther into this video, yes, there's gonna be a lot of background noise in this one. I'm gonna do my best. Really sorry. They have been testing the emergency service sirens since 8 o'clock this morning. It is almost 2 in the afternoon as of me filming this, and I think there's some tree removal going on up that way. That's been happening for weeks, but we are gonna keep on trucking through all of this. On to this week's episode. The album we are covering today is Revolver by the Beatles. Congrats to those who guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post the hints to what next week's album is gonna be. Alright, let's take the plastic off. And my copy is a repress. I bought this specifically so I would have the UK or the canon track listing of Revolver. Do you have any idea how hard it was for me to match the album art this week? Do you have any idea how little black and white I have in my wardrobe? This is all I got. All of the rest is in the VU and Nico video. I tried to do John's little fisherman cap justice, and a big inspiration was Taylor Swift for Harper's Bazaar magazine back in 2018. She interviewed Patty Boyd for that issue. They took some really cute photos together. Taylor did a whole photo shoot inspired by Patty, and it proved just how much all blondes look alike. Back to the Revolver cover. This art is by Klaus Voormann. The Beatles met him during their time in Hamburg, kept in touch after they went back to Liverpool, and called him in for Revolver. Klaus was particularly inspired by the song Tomorrow Never Knows, but wanted to do something a little against the grain. I didn't want to jump into a song so quickly in the video, but this is a rare case where the album art warrants it. Tomorrow Never Knows is the Beatles' foray into psych and sound collage, and when you think psych, you think lots of texture, loud patterns, abstract patterns, and bright colors. So basically, the Sgt. Pepper's art. Klaus wanted to capture the textures, patterns, and sounds he heard, but thought full color would be too predictable. At the same time, Klaus is showing interest in 19th century British illustration. The outcome was this beautiful black and white line drawing. It's got these photos of the Beatles collaged in. It's wonderfully intricate. You could pore over this thing for hours. The back cover was photographed by Robert Whittaker at EMI Studios. The guys have taken a little bit of style inspiration from Bob Dylan. The color version of this photo shows the Beatles wearing light earth tones with their dark sunglasses and Dylan's signature cigarette. This photo George is holding, it's a little dark, it's obscured in this shot, we can't see it, but it is in fact the proof for that infamous Butcher cover. For a long time, this was my favorite Beatles album art. I had this green t-shirt with the Revolver art on it. I think this must have been middle school. I got rid of it a long time ago and kind of kicking myself for doing that, even though it would never fit me today. On Revolver, we of course have all 4 of the Bottles, I mean the Beatles. We have John Lennon on vocals, guitar, Hammond organ, and mellotron. Paul McCartney on vocals, bass, some guitar, and piano. George Harrison on guitar, sitar, tambura, and lead vocals on Taxman and Love You Too. And Ringo Starr on drums, various other percussion, and lead vocals on Yellow Submarine. There are quite a few special guests on this album, including but not limited to Anil Bhagwat, who plays the tabla on Love You Too, Beatle roadie Mal Evans and future Apple Corps exec Neil Aspinall both contribute to Yellow Submarine, and oh my god, we have all three of the blondies who inspire my personal style appearing on Revolver. We have Marianne Faithfull, Brian Jones, and Patty Boyd, all heard in the chatter on Yellow Submarine. This album was produced by George Martin. He wears a few hats during Revolver production. Get it? Including engineer, conductor, session player, and tape loop mad scientist. This album was engineered by Jeff Emmerich, and roll transition. I'm starting this one off the way I start off every Beatles video, with a hefty disclaimer. This will be far from a comprehensive review of the history of Revolver. That would be impossible to do. The Beatles are one of the best documented bands of all of music history. I will simply be giving an overview of what's relevant to the music on Revolver. To begin with, Revolver really only happened because the Beatles quit touring in August of 1965. The Beatles quit touring because, frankly, it just wasn't safe anymore. Sure, the height of Beatlemania was one thing. Their crowds were always out of control, but now they were getting on the bad sides of local governments for causing total chaos and even receiving threats. Without having to worry about reproducing the sound of the album live, the Beatles could essentially do whatever the hell they wanted. That's the popular reasoning for why Revolver happened. The other reason that I don't hear as many people talking about is Paul McCartney beginning the journey of broadening his music taste. He really takes this to the next level between this album's production and Sgt. Pepper's, but for right now, Paul has his eye on what Brian Wilson is doing. Like I've said in every single Beatles video I've made, and definitely the Pet Sounds video, Lennon-McCartney and Brian had this sort of friendly competition going, this ping-ponging back and forth of inspiration. Rubber Soul from '65 was hugely inspirational to the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. Right now, moving into '66, the Beach Boys are putting together Pet Sounds right about now, actually. Brian is in the height of his musical sabbatical. He stopped touring with the Beach Boys back in December of '64, so he's got a lot more time on his hands to be consuming high volumes of a lot of different kinds of music. Paul picked up on this, and he starts following Brian's lead. He's expanding his musical horizons, getting a little more daring with his composition, and thus comes up with Eleanor Rigby, a total Baroque pop moment. This broadening of horizons wasn't just limited to music, it extended into art and culture. Paul was getting hip to avant-garde art, John would do the same, that's how he met Yoko Ono, and this includes tape loops. Tape loops are a huge part of what we hear on Revolver. Paul is also experiencing great upheaval in his personal life. If songs like For No One are any indication, his power couple with Muse actress Jane Asher is in serious peril. Meanwhile, a certain Beatle wife's interest in Eastern philosophy is about to turn the Beatles' world upside down. In January of 1966, George Harrison marries his first wife, model Patty Boyd. She takes interest in the whole Hare Krishna thing and shares this interest with the two most important people in her life, her sister Jenny and her new husband George. George falls head over heels in love with everything and anything India, this becomes a lifelong love of his. He's reading the literature, he visits India, takes this selfie at the Taj Mahal, he's gone vegetarian, and he's picked up a few new instruments not too long ago. We hear the sitar for the first time on a Beatles album with Rubber Soul, of course, Norwegian Wood. The drone gets its time to shine on Tomorrow Never Knows, and whatever Norwegian Wood's energy is, it gets cranked up by about 1,000 and put on Revolver with the song Love You Too. Listen, it's not of my belief that using drugs is essential to making or listening to Psych, but the Beatles certainly partook. It'd be a bold-faced lie to say this awakening didn't at least partially influence Revolver. After getting dosed by their fucking dentist, John and George are hip to LSD. Paul isn't on board. Just how much were they taking and how did they feel about it? George famously said, and I quote, "That's the thing about LSD, you don't need to take it twice. That being said, I've taken it lots of times." John's taking an interest in Eastern philosophy too, but it's interesting. John and George start at this fairly similar point, and they end up on completely opposite ends of the spectrum. John believes enlightenment lies in the self, in the power of the human, while George believes enlightenment is through a god. And Ringo's, just being Ringo. As they're experiencing more of the real world, the guys are getting more gutsy and realer with their songwriting. See Taxman. Now, I always wondered what the deal with Taxman was. These guys are surely made of money. They're the biggest band in the world, so why are they complaining about taxes? Well, when I read Patty's book, I discovered that the British Treasury was taking a good chunk of the money that the Beatles made. With a little more research, I found that the British Tax Office was collecting as much as 96% of the Beatles' income. 96%! That is unfathomable these days. You have a lot of things to pay for when you're famous, right? Being famous isn't cheap. You have to pay for your producers, your staffers, you have to pay for your transportation and your property and your security. Being famous isn't cheap, and that asinine tax rate was not helping. The album title has a double meaning. It could either mean how an LP revolves on a turntable, or like the chamber of a revolver. Working titles included Abracadabra, Magic Circle, and even some parodies of albums that the Beatles had on the brain. Beatles on Safari as a nod to the Beach Boys, Freewheelin' Beatles as a nod to Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. See, Beatles are kind of wearing jackets like his on this cover. My personal favorite of the working titles is After Geography, a parody of the Rolling Stones' Aftermath. After math. After geography. Like this video if your worst subject in school was also math. The album that would eventually come to be known as Revolver was recorded from April through June of 1966. The guys did not want to work at EMI Studios for this one, but I think they had some kind of contractual obligation to be there. Engineer Norman Smith leaves and is replaced by a very familiar name in Beatles history. We mentioned him a little earlier in this video, Geoff Emerick. Now, you think it'd be a daunting task to gain the trust of the biggest band in the world, but Geoff fit into the Beatle machine well. Him and George Martin become somewhat of a dream team. George Martin's role in the Beatles' lives is shifting a little bit from the facilitator of collaboration to the magical magician. Magical magician. Oh, today's been a rough day, people. The magician who made all of the Beatles' wacky ideas come true. The first of those wacky ideas was the first song completed for Revolver, arguably the most technically demanding of the bunch, Tomorrow Never Knows. The song was named for one of Ringo's Ringoisms, see 8 Days a Week, and this is one of the most layered Beatles tracks we've ever gotten. There's a tambura drone on the bottom, tape loops, 2 sitar pieces sped up and ran backwards, John's vocals are processed to hell, and those seagull cries are actually Paul's laugh sped up. Somewhere along the way, the decision was made to dampen the sound of Ringo's bass drum. This was done by either putting a jacket or a blanket inside the drum. Then the mics were moved closer than they'd ever been to Ringo's kit, within a foot of it, and they compressed the hell out of whatever they recorded. This proved to be game-changing for how drums were recorded. The non-album singles to promote Revolver were, of course, Paperback Writer and Rain. Michael Lindsay Hogg dropped in on Revolver production to make the video for Paperback Writer. He will become very important in a couple years, but we've got years before that happens. The final track listing of Revolver goes as follows. Opening up side 1, we have Taxman, followed by Eleanor Rigby. Then I'm Only Sleeping. Next, Love You Too. Then Here, There, and Everywhere, followed by Yellow Submarine. And side 1 closes with She Said, She Said. Opening up side 2, we have Good Day Sunshine, followed by And Your Bird Can Sing. Then For No One. Next, Dr. Robert. Then I Want to Tell You, followed by Got to Get You Into My Life, and the album closes with Tomorrow Never Knows. If you have the US track listing of Revolver, again, I have the UK track listing, your album nixes I'm Only Sleeping, And Your Bird Can Sing, and Dr. Robert. This is a unique US Beatles release in which no other songs from other album cycles were subbed in, like you see on US Rubber Soul. Those dropped songs from Revolver, of course, show up on Yesterday and Today. Revolver was released in August of 1966. UK reception was generally good, and US reception was good, but put an asterisk next to that word. There was one little thing attached to the Beatles album release at this time. Oh boy. Let's talk about John Lennon's bigger than Jesus comment. Okay, so there's one big thing that people either entirely forget or maybe they don't even think about when they're covering the bigger than Jesus incident, and that is this. Comedy is entirely attached to culture. I mean, think about it. It varies hugely by where you're from and the culture you grew up in. That was one of the most important things my film professor taught me while I was in college. American comedies don't perform well in France, for example. Our comedy is way too obvious for them. Some acceptable jokes in France do not fly over here, and vice versa. Only big ol' nerds in America find subtle, snarky, sarcastic British humor funny. That's really the crux of the bigger than Jesus incident. In March of 1966, the Beatles gave this interview in London. John, champion of snarky, sarcastic humor, said the Beatles, and rock and roll as a whole, were getting bigger than Jesus, as a very obvious joke. But the media over here lost their fucking minds because Americans who generally do not get British humor, especially when it's in print. I mean, think about it. Aren't jokes hard to decipher when they're over text because you don't have body language, facial expressions, delivery to rely on? When you take that and you consider just how Christian the United States was in the 60s, a lot more than now, and you throw in a dash of PR nightmare, absolute madman John Lennon, you get this. Oh dear God, can you imagine John Lennon with a Twitter account? That man would be getting canceled like every other week. It seems silly nowadays to have something like that affect your album release to the degree at which it did, but it's 1966, the news cycle moves a lot slower than it does today. Revolver is now remembered as a pioneering psych album. However, I did debunk this in my Sunshine Superman video. Generally, outside of that, Revolver is remembered one of two ways. Number one, I find that this is remembered most as a prelude to Sgt. Pepper's. That's especially true with a song like Tomorrow Never Knows. And number two, depending on who you ask, Revolver is superior to Sgt. Pepper's. Either way, this thing is remembered as a sister album to Sgt. Pepper's. I always hear Revolver mentioned in tandem with that record. So, what do I think of Revolver? Alright, so while this is my favorite period of the Beatles music, it starts with Rubber Soul, Revolver isn't my favorite Beatles album. Like I've said before, my favorite Beatles record is the White Album. So I'm in this awkward strata right now of listening to an album that came in between two of my favorite Beatles albums. I admittedly have not given Revolver enough attention before this. Revolver comes out swinging because of Taxman. Acknowledging my bias here, I am a George Gurley, and he kills it on this one. I also love the Taxman guitar solo. It's one of my favorites on any Beatles song. It's bested only by While My Guitar Gently Weeps, so I guess this is my favorite Beatles guitar solo played by a Beatle. Shout out to Paul McCartney. It's a snarky little song, but those backing vocals through the bridge keep things from getting too serious. As you know by now, I get scared when an album has a really strong opener, because that means either A, it holds out for a while and then the finish is disappointing, or B, it has a strong opening and a strong closing and there's a serious dip in quality in the middle. There is a dip for me here, but it's very small. Dr. Robert has never grabbed me. I Want to Tell You is all right, and I've never liked Got to Get You Into My Life. Oh my god, I forgot I Want to Tell You before revisiting Revolver for this video. It's so embarrassing, I know, but it was like just wiped from my memory. I was looking at the track listing and went, I Want to Tell You? I've never heard this. Then I listened to the first 5 seconds and go, oh wait, I actually have heard this. I'm Only Sleeping makes everything feel like it's moving in slow motion, even when it's not. That slick, lazy guitar, the very slight delay on John's vocal tracking, and of course, the drag on the backtracking. Love You Too is about all kinds of lovemaking, from making love to crafting it in meditation, sharing quality time, singing songs together, super hippy-dippy stuff. Have to make note of a strong point of the Revolver sequencing here. I'm always anticipating Love You Too after I'm Only Sleeping. Those two songs are a great pair. I tolerate Yellow Submarine. It's just Ringo being Ringo, but don't get me wrong, I do love the Ringo character songs. It's just that this is the fourth best of his 4 character songs. The Paul songs on this album have these beautiful subtleties worked in. You can tell that the high volumes of music Paul is consuming have these same little intricacies worked in. All of 2 measures with finger snaps on Here, There, and Everywhere, but those are the most delightful measures of the song, and the French horn on For No One. Good Day Sunshine, which I overlooked for a long time, is deceptively simple. This has become one of my favorite songs on the album. There's something so beautiful about we take a walk, the sun is shining down. It's beautiful in its simplicity. It also makes Revolver a spring album. Sorry, I don't make the rules. Then that line is followed by burns my feet as they touch the ground. It seems too much of a good thing is a bad thing, and it'll burn you in the end. All of the Paul songs on this album, even the ones that sound happy, are either underscored or overscored by this melancholy. They're dripping in it. The guys have realized that finding and keeping love is a lot more than just holding hands. This is ringing especially true for Paul. Even if there's this slight loss of innocence in the themes, the whole album feels bright, and this is something I love about this era of the Beatles. It's my favorite thing about Rubber Soul. Don't get me wrong, I do love the slightly gritty, unshaven White Album Get Back Beatles. That back to basics thing is totally my jam. But cuts like Andrew Bird Can Sing, especially Andrew Bird Can Sing, have this crisp flavor in the guitars that just perks you right up. Its charisma is infectious. She said, ugh, I want to love this song. I really want to love it, and I feel like I should. I feel like a bad Beatles fan for not warming up to it. I don't know why I can't jump the hurdle from like to love. I settle into it more when the beat kind of shifts on its heels, becomes more of a march. This song is truly where Ringo gets his time to shine, not Yellow Goddamn Submarine. His drumming is bright, expressive, and lovely on She Said, She Said. I feel bad for not mentioning the Giles Martin mix of Revolver, like, at all in this video, but this is a Revolver overview, not a Giles Martin Revolver mix overview. I don't own that album, so I'm not covering it here. But I have to mention Hearing Rain at its original speed. OG Rain is so cool and tells me that Ringo deserves a little more credit than he gets. His drumming is bright, expressive, and lovely. And of course, I can't not mention Tomorrow Never Knows. I like it. I realize its overall historical significance, but is it my favorite? I'll say that the Beatles will far surpass this song as they go forward. Is that a train sound? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I know it's an orchestra, but it does kind of sound like a train passing. As for the assumption that Revolver is the sister album to Sgt. Pepper's, dare I say that Sgt. Pepper's is more of a sister album to the White Album? To hear me out. Revolver isn't so much a prelude to Sgt. Pepper's as it is to psych Beatles in general. I consider Magical Mystery Tour to be a hell of a lot more psychedelic than Sgt. Pepper's ever was. Instead, I'll be pairing Revolver with Rubber Soul. Those roots from this album aren't totally gone yet. Moments like Andrew Bird Can Sing, I Want to Tell You, Dr. Robert, they have stronger ties to Rubber Soul than Revolver has ties to Sgt. Pepper's. Really the only songs indicative of Sgt. Pepper's on Revolver are Love You Too and Tomorrow Never Knows. With Revolver, the Beatles are rooting themselves in decidedly grown-up topics. Money, loneliness, doing the drugs, doing the sex, mortality, souring relationships, contemplating life and existence. The boys aren't wanting to hold your hand anymore. They're wanting something a little deeper and more meaningful, but they still have this youthful outlook. I could wait forever, I've got time. I didn't want to see this album as a transitional album or a turning point for the Beatles, but it kinda is. Revolver is this jetty into the bright, screaming future, and on all fronts, the Beatles are about to set off right into the heart of it, whether they're ready or not. My personal favorites on this one are Taxman, I'm Only Sleeping, Good Day Sunshine, And Your Bird Can Sing, and For No One. Remember, if you want to keep up with all my favorite songs from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that is it. That is Revolver by the Beatles. It's been a minute since I had a Beatles record on Vinyl Monday, so what do you think? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums I love. And if you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11 a.m. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!